and welcome once again to the Progressions of Consciousness radio program. We're here on the Community Listening Network, www.clnradio.com. We're in a short series here called we're dealing with perception, the nature of perception. I was thinking I would spend 1 or 2 shows on this, but in considering it, what I've realized is that this element of realizing the role and the function of perception and how important it is to our understanding of ourselves and the universe and of God, that I really will probably spend this show and perhaps the next show, maybe we can wrap it up in this show, we'll see how it goes. But we really need to start thinking about perception and how it plays in our lives. Now, I recently had a conversation with an old friend, and we were talking about the idea that the way that we act in society or in any ordered, structured realm, that there are rules that go along with that. Now, I'm not talking about the overt rules, the thou shalt not. I'm talking about the more subtle rules, how you behave and the things that you do. For instance, how do you decide who you're going to marry? How do you decide what school you're going to go to, what career you're going to have, etc., etc.? Well, these things are largely conditioned, and we'd be willing to accept that. One of the things we were talking about was how so many people tend to get involved in, various relationships, and I'm one of them. I'm not going to exclude myself from that camp. That can be unhealthy. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a romantic relationship. It can be any relationship. And the person I was speaking with was saying, when I was a child, the influences of my family and my community and my culture dictated that I approached the issue of, getting a spouse in a certain way. And my question was, that's all well and good, but who is to say it has to be that way? One of the things we discussed in the last program was the whole genre of the political machine, where the candidate gets up there and they tell their lies and they get in office and they don't do it. And one of the common responses to my objections are, well, it's that or nothing. I mean, we know that they're going to lie, but, what are we going to do, just not vote? And that's not at all what I'm suggesting. What I'm saying is that we are in an impossibly unnegotiable paradigm that you've got to do what everyone else is doing. You've got to be a lemming. We crowd our children into schools and we teach them from books where the information is so old that if someone were to come to me and try to sell me a newspaper from a year ago, I would be insulted. But here we're gathering our children by the millions into school and we're teaching them old information. And to you and me, that's acceptable. Maybe not conceptually, because, what we have to do is we have to jump into the daily grind, and we have to go to work, and we have to pay the bills, we have to pay the mortgage and the electric bill, and we have to provide for our children so that when they get older, they can do the same thing. Be involved in the grind and pay the mortgage and have their children going to schools that are teaching lies. I hate to put it that strongly, but they're lies. And if you're looking at a textbook about any area of science, within the time that it takes to print the textbook, the information has been updated. So while I'm not against, in general, I'm not against the idea of education, I think education is targeting the wrong target when it comes to humans. Education is designed to fill your mind with information about something. But as we spoke in the last program about John Nash, and to use his words, he said classes will dull your mind. Because the true target of education should be to sharpen your reasoning facilities, to sharpen your critical thinking skills, not to give you a bunch of information. You know, if I give you a fish, you'll eat for a day. If I teach you to fish, you'll eat for a lifetime. The true target of education should be to teach you how to think critically, to teach you how to gather your own information. It's not really an easy subject when you start talking about how things are working these days. The world that we live in and the systems that have been in place for such a long time are so difficult to defeat. So really, the only thing you can really do is start using your critical thinking capabilities. As we said before, don't necessarily start throwing things out. Just start thinking. You know, I worked for IBM from 1988 to 1992. And the thing that impresses me about IBM is that they're probably one of, if not the most sound and advanced technological companies in the world. And they get that way by innovation. They create innovation. Unfortunately for IBM, other people take their innovation and market it as their own because, you know, IBM is terrible at marketing, unfortunately. But they have a culture and they have a way of looking at things, and they're not about to change it. I mean, IBM is not going anywhere. The point being is they had a motto, and the motto was one word. It was think. Their motto was think. Well, we don't have time to think these days. We don't have time to employ critical thinking. Now, this program today is part 2 of the nature of perception. And if I were to summarize what perception is that mechanism that takes the data that we receive through the senses, mixes it with what we were taught or conditioned, mixes it with things we have learned from our environment, mixes it with the biases that we have developed over our lives, and mixes it again with who we think we are as ego, and spits out a ticker tape of truth. And I want to contrast truth with fact, because there's a great difference. Fact is what it is. It doesn't need proof. It exists on its own merit. Truth, on the other hand, is a person's personal perspective about those facts. Now, I mentioned the movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe. Well, that's based on a true story. But the movie I'm about to mention, it was a movie with Henry Fonda and George C. Scott. And it was called 12 Angry Men. And the concept was that a murder trial had just ended. Both the prosecution and the defense had rested. So now the case went to the jury. So the jury had to take the evidence and decide whether or not the kid was guilty of the crime. Well, everybody entered the jury room, you know, happy because this was going to be a quick one. It was really easy. You had eyewitnesses. You had, you know, everything in place. The guy's guilty. You know, done deal. Let's go home. And what did Henry Fonda do, who was the principal character in the movie. Henry Fonda said, wait a minute. And then he did the one thing that you're not supposed to do. He asked a question. He said, well, what about this? Or what about that? Now, any question that starts with what about is probably a good question, because it means that, you know, you've listened to the story, you've gotten all of the education that you need, but in the process of receiving that education, something didn't make sense. All right, and this is why I'm so hard on religion and Christianity, because the purpose of many types of social orders, not the least of which is religion, is to cause a person to accept the education without questioning it, without questioning that education. As I said before, I'm not against the process of education. I'm against the premise that education is the principal method of growth. Well, no, it's not. Of course, you need to have information to make decisions about what you're going to do in life. But education is not the way to receive that information. The way to receive that information is to tap into that intuitive part of yourself that is still connected to source on a conscious level, because that's what consciousness is, to tap into that consciousness and to come up with your own questions that lead to a manifestation of source that is unique. That's what Einstein did. That's what Newton did. That's what Da Vinci did. You know, innovation, that's what the engineers at IBM did. Innovation is not a product of education. Innovation is a product of critical thought. You know, we're in an age now where many people consider it, you know, an electronic age, but actually we're in a crystal age when it comes to technology. Not so much like the you know, allegedly the Lemurians and the Atlanteans were, but every single device that we use today is laced with crystal technology. The industry calls them semiconductors, but those semiconductors are crystals. Well, what is the basis of this semiconductor technology? We call them integrated circuits, we call them computer chips, whatever you want to call them. Well, the basis of this technology is something called the transistor. The transistor is something it's a solid state device that manipulates the way electronic signals flow through a circuit. Now, prior to having these transistors, these solid state devices, electronics, even digital electronics, use something called a vacuum tube. And that was what was referred to as gas state technology. Now, just for a little background, physical science recognizes 4 states of matter. That is the plasma state, which, you know, hopefully in some show I'll get into detail about, but it's the basis of, you know, the whole science fiction concept of plasma drive. And it's not so much science fiction anymore, because, you know, NASA and other scientists are really thinking seriously about using the plasma state of matter as a fuel for spacecraft, because it can go a lot further and last a lot longer, is a lot more energetic than the other states. But be that as it may, we have the plasma state of matter. We have the gas state of matter, and we're all familiar with gases and what they are. We have the liquid state of matter, and we have the solid state of matter. And to give you some context, a very common context, water commonly exists in all 3 states. It exists as ice, it exists as flowing water, and it exists as steam. So you can see that, you know, these are the various states. Well, solid state is a state that, where the molecules of of matter are so tightly packed that they don't appear to be moving. Of course, we all know that molecules are always moving. Everything that appears to be stationary is actually vibrating, is moving. But to our perception, once again, there's that perception again, to our perception, it's solid and unmoving. Well, getting back to this crystal technology issue, you had these brilliant guys that developed a transistor that did the same thing that a vacuum tube did, but it did it with solid matter, semiconductor material that is crystalline. So our technology is currently in a crystal state. We're in a crystal age. The reason that's significant is because we were able to take these very large, very energy-consuming and emitting devices called vacuum tubes and replace them with these solid-state devices that were so efficient that we can make them microscopic, and they still behave even more efficiently than the vacuum tube. The point is, solid-state technology, the transistor was not created by people filling their heads with information. It came by people approaching things from a standpoint of critical thought. Now, we talked a lot in the last program about the mechanisms that are designed to control us. And you have many people that are out there saying, oh, here's another one of these conspiracy kooks that's saying that, everything that's happening in the world, everything that we don't like is some conscious conspiracy by a group of people that is just trying to take advantage of us. Well, first of all, let me say they're not trying to take advantage of us. They are taking advantage of us, and we're letting them do it. Let me quote to you a famous quote by Adolf Hitler. You find it on the website. And it goes, how fortunate it is for leaders that people don't think. So you think that all of these people, all of these millions of kids in school and all of these millions of students in college are thinking? No, they're not thinking. They're assimilating. They're receiving information. That is not thinking. That's taking on someone else's thoughts, and there's a certain need for that. I have to say that there, at some point, you have to take in information, but only up until the point where you get the hang of it, you get the hang of the process, and begin to formulate your own way of thinking about things. Because, as I said, the major venues of social, political outlet, etc., are designed to control your perception. Now, the reason I'm taking so much time with this area of the nature of perception is because I'm going to eventually start digging into some very, very esoteric ideas about who we are as humans and what is the true nature of spirit. But if you're stuck in a paradigm that has already told you who you are and what spirit is, and you're convinced and have a model already of what you think it is, then anything I say is just going to bounce off of you. I remember hearing a saying years and years ago by a friend of mine, and they said to me, I don't understand how people can be racist. How can people hate other people because of the color of their skin? And I repeated to them a saying that I had heard years ago that says, racism cannot be reasoned out because it's not reasoned in. Let me repeat that. Racism cannot be reasoned out because it's not reasoned in. It's conditioned. It's taught. Now, the implication here is that for the most part, the ideals that we as individuals hold as most dear and feel are the most important things in our lives and are the most true, the question to ask is, how many of those things are like racism? How many of those things do we feel have some sort of reasonable and logical basis to them, when all the time they are strictly and almost entirely a product of conditioning? Excuse me. So to compare something like racism, for instance, to religion almost seems like a misnomer. But that speaks exactly to my point, that the information that we have received to reach a certain conclusion is not nearly as important as the dynamic that we have used to come to this conclusion, which again is an education of our perception. So what I'm going to ask the listener to do is to presume or to consider as plausible that the top 10 things that you hold as the most important and true things in your life may actually be the product of conditioning. I'm not saying that they are. I'm just asking you to consider that for a moment. The most important elements of your life, especially with regard to who you are as a human being, where you've come from, what your destiny is, but we can settle on who we are now, what we're made of. Your most important points of truth may actually not be accurate at all, but based upon an education, a conditioning of your perception. Going back to the racism thing, I have quite a bit of tolerance for racism. Not that I either appreciate or agree with the message of racism, but rather that I understand the mechanism that has created a perspective of racism in the mind and in the heart of the person that is a racist. Now let me hasten to add that everyone is biased to a certain degree. Everyone has preferences. I'm not talking about preference. I'm talking about hardcore racism that says, I hate a person because of, for instance, the color of their skin, or the country they come from, or the religion they practice, or the way they speak. Whatever it may be, here you have the quintessential example of perception being controlled by conditioning rather than information. Now, I'm not going to deny that every stereotype has its basis, and if you're using that stereotype to tell a funny joke, then hey, I'm all for it. But if you're using that stereotype as a basis for your outlook in life, or as a basis for the way that you treat another person, then you are in the trap, and you are the perfect example and the perfect evidence that my premise that perception rather than critical thought rules a person. You're my proof, and thank you very much. So before we get into the deeper aspects of where I want to go and how those aspects relate to our function as architects of the Aquarian age, we must absolutely come to the conclusion that it's not our information that is to be questioned. Rather, it is our perception that is to be questioned or re-educated. I said in one of the earlier programs that I believe that what we call the physical body is actually no different than the subtle bodies. Now, what do we think about when we think about the bodies? As we said before, you have the physical body, you have the astral body, you have the mental body, you have the emotional body. All of these bodies that are in coincidence with the physical body, and then you start getting into the meridians of the body and the chakras and energy centers and these types of things, and it works into kind of a mosaic and a snapshot for what many, particularly the metaphysically inclined or New Agers, what many perceive about ourselves as cosmic beings, as members of the universal order. What I submit is that even those of us who consider ourselves enlightened or learned in those areas have succumbed to a concept of the physical body that has been conditioned. That our perception of who we are in the physical body has been conditioned by interests that are not benefited at all by us believing that we, in totality and without lack or need for improvement, are spiritual beings. We are perfect, powerful, beautiful, grand, spiritual beings, and some religions have said, well, we're spirits, we're spiritual beings that live in a physical body. But I believe even this misses the point, because what I'm trying to say is that the physical body itself is not, even within what we define physical, is not physical, but spiritual. It is spirit. In fact, the physical creation itself is all spirit. Now, I'm going to refer you once again to my website, to the Progressions of Consciousness States chart. Now, in that chart, in the center of the chart, you have two concentric circles. And these concentric circles are my model's representation of the initial manifestation of Source in its experiment of duality and relativity. Now, you cannot assign any linear concept of time and space within this conversation. And that may be difficult because our perceptions are so used to the ideals of time and space and sequence. So I'm using that terminology, but you really can't apply it in a practical sense, only for the sense of this discussion. So when the Source, who is perfect and infinite, decided at some point in time, again, don't take that literally, said, hey, it's kind of boring being everything and knowing everything. You know what I'd like to try? I'd like to see what it's like to be subjective. Now, how do you take Source that is perfect and has no lack of anything, including knowledge? How does Source then become subjective? Well, what is subjectivity? Subjectivity is a personal perspective of what's happening. So what do I mean by that? Okay, you got 10 people in a room, and there are certain facts about the room, and there are certain events that occur. You can take those 10 people and question them about the room and the events in the room, and no matter how similar their account, you will also find that there is a uniqueness about their accounts that could almost seem to contradict the accounts of others that are in the room. And in some cases, it could absolutely contradict the accounts of other people in the room. Put succinctly, those 10 people can see the same events and experience the same physical sense stimula, and yet all come up with different conclusions and different truths about what happened. Well, why does this happen? Well, this happens because of this thing called perception. But the mechanism that leads to all 10 of those people coming up with a different story is a perfectly legitimate mechanism, because that mechanism is the mechanism that Source chose to make the experiment of subjectivity meaningful. So what is subjectivity? Subjectivity is my own individual, personal perspective about what's happening. Now, I don't mean to infer that this mechanism of perspective is something that we should throw out or something that we should reevaluate. What I mean to infer, and what I'm saying straight out, is that our perception of things, our subjective perspective about things, that mechanism of perspective, subjective perspective, has been used to turn us into mental and therefore physical and emotional slaves. The perception was never meant to make us follow along like lemmings. It was not designed for that purpose. Subjectivity and perception are designed to create unique manifestations of Source. Subjectivity and perception are designed to create, not to become subject to creation, but to participate as individual, subjective, moral agents in a process of creation that makes what I create unique, and it makes what you create unique, and it makes what the other 8 of the 10 people in the room create unique. So now, what do we do with these subjective creations? Well, we take these subjective creations and we join them together into a mosaic of potential. And drawing upon that mosaic, we then take that information, that education, and we don't then write a book necessarily about the things that these 10 people have discovered. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but don't stop there. We don't then take the subjective observations of these 10 people and create a religion out of it, or create a science out of it, or say, hey, look at this, this is great. You know, we've created this beautiful, powerful thing that does unimaginable things and is of incalculable benefit. We don't take those things and then stop. Rather, we then take those, the result of that perspective of the 10 different people, we assimilate that information, that's called education, and now we run with it and create something even more profound. But now, instead of creating something that's based strictly on my own subjectivity, I've taken the productive results of the subjectivity of the other 9 people in the room, added it to my own uniqueness, starting asking new questions, and now I synthesize and create a new, more accurate, more powerful, more beautiful, more beneficial, more expedient perspective, and I come back in the room with 10 other people that have done the same thing, and what I'm engaged in now is an exponential process of creation. Well, that's what Source did, but it started with relativity. It started with Source saying, well, I'm not just going to be one anymore, I'm going to be more than one. I'm going to engage in an experiment of subjectivity that is going to create an exponential pattern of emergence and growth, discovery and creation. Now, the process that I have just described doesn't resemble at all what we as a society and what we as a world consider education. Now, it does occasionally with your Einsteins and your John Nashes, but invariably that result of critical thought and that result of imagination, that result of creative thought, runs headlong into the programmed paradigm of truth. Truth is a limiting element, not a liberating one. Truth is an element that says, I have the answer, and this is how I'm going to act. The problem with truth is, whether it's accurate or not, a person tends to hold on to it. This is the nature of perception. This is the nature of perception. This is what I've been talking about in the last program and in this program. So when we start talking about the Aquarian age and what's going to happen in the Aquarian age, what we have is a potential, and you might even call it an obligation, but certainly an opportunity to partake in the process of education that doesn't end in an answer that'll get you a job paying $200,000 a year. What you have is a process that ends in a cycle that doesn't end. A perpetual cycle of growth and emergence. Now, as I said before, if you think about the information that has been uncovered in the scientific community, you know, you can't even write a textbook anymore, because the discoveries that are being uncovered are literally being transformed and revealed on different levels on a daily basis. And you have these very heavy and deep scientists scratching their heads and saying, what in the world is going on? In the area of in the area of quantum mechanics, for instance, they're coming up with these crazy ideals about, you know, what reality is made of. I mean, besides the fact that we've already known for many years, for instance, that matter, or what we consider mass, is predominantly space, and I don't mean outer space, because outer space is not made of nothing, it's made of gas. It's made of molecules of gas. No, the space that I'm talking about, the space that occupies the particles of the atom, is not made of mass. It's just, what is it? It's just vacuum. There's no mass. It's empty. There's nothing there, according to our current models. But what we're finding is that this solid matter is really sort of like a silly putty kind of thing, that it literally becomes something when you look at it. Alright, now this way of thinking is going to be foreign to some of my listeners, so let me slow down and explain in layman's terms what particle physics and theoretical particle physics has come up with. What they've come up with is that physical matter only exists because we're looking at it, because we're observing it. Were we not to be involved in the process of observing it, it would just exist as a field of probability. Now, being that we have a nature as physical beings, if you will, we are at some point observing something. We're participating in a conscious and sentient manner with something. But by and large, we presume that our observation of physical reality is the effect, not the cause. In other words, you're driving down the street and you see a red light and you stop. Well, you stop because of the red light. What I'm inferring on a more esoteric level, and please don't take this literally, please take it in the spirit which is given, what I'm inferring is that the light turns red because we have stopped. And this is what particle physics is saying, that reality exists because we observe it. Not that we in a process observe physical reality because it exists, but rather physical reality exists because we have observed it. And this speaks directly to perception. We talk about the three dimensions, and it's easy for us to think in terms of 1, 2, and 3 dimensions, because we live in a so-called physical world of height, depth, and width. So we have volume. We have a perspective that says, hey, we live in the third dimension. And then you have discussions about the fourth dimension that equate the fourth dimension to time, or shall we say the lack thereof. But I'm much more fascinated with the fifth dimension. Now, Albert Einstein and many of his contemporaries asserted that the human species, the human being, this so-called physical realm that we live in, is not the third dimension at all, but not even, it's not even the fourth dimension, but that human beings literally exist in the fifth dimension. And Einstein looked at this obviously from a theoretical standpoint, but he approached the subject also from a mathematical standpoint. So while we look at things in height, depth, and width, however you want to say it, Einstein said, no, we are fifth dimensional beings. It's our perception that exists in the third and fourth dimension. Our actual essence exists in the fifth dimension. Now, hold on, all you physicists out there. I mean, we all know from a conceptual standpoint that we, as a discrete and subjective sentient individual, exist in all dimensions and in all planes simultaneously. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that our true nature as physical beings is one of a fifth dimensional existence, not a third or fourth dimensional existence. This fifth dimensional place, if you will, is the place of probability. Probability. Alright, you've had many people from an esoteric standpoint look at life and say, well, if things are not what you want them to be, if your experience is not what you want it to be, then why not consider other possibilities? Now, what is possibility? Well, possibility says, well, here are my options that are available to me, but on the other hand, there are options that may not be readily, that may not be apparent, but that are also available. So possibility says that there are options that are not necessarily visible but may be available. Probability says that of the options that are available, I'm going to pick one of them. The difference between possibility and probability within the context that I'm speaking is that possibility limits itself to its perception of itself. In other words, a good analogy is that possibility is like window shopping. You're walking down the street and you see this thing in the window that you want. Now, for the guys, it's going to be invariably some gadget. For the women, it may be a pair of shoes, or actually vice versa on both counts. But let's leave that alone. But you're going to see that item and you're going to say, I really would like to have that. It is possible that I could have that item, but I don't have the money. Or, I have the money, but, I need to pay a bill with it, or do this other thing with it. So possibility is sort of like I'm on the outside of things, and I'm postulating that I could have something other than what I have. It's possible. What the particle physics is saying is that what actually exists as observable physical matter is the result of capturing probability, not possibility. Now that's extremely significant, because probability says it's not like a window shopping excursion, it's more like a buffet. So I've already paid to get into the buffet, and now there's all this food. Well, I'm not going to eat all of it. I'm going to pick something from the options. Well, that's where probability comes in. So when we start talking about the fifth dimension is that area where probability exists. We are in the buffet. We are here. The probability factor is that I can pick anything that I want. It's not a matter of possibility, it's a matter of probability. Once again, we're speaking in relative terms here because I'm forced to use language. I'm forced to use English. What I'm asking the listener to do is to open their intuition to the underlying esotery of what I'm saying here. As human beings, our perception has been conditioned toward the possible, not the probable. And when we're talking about as a species being architects of the Aquarian age, we're going to do so from a paradigm of the probable, not the possible. We're going to do so from a posture of critical thought, not education. We're going to do so from a perspective of creativity, not information gathering. We're going to do so from a perspective of individual subjectivity, not group thought or conditioning. The place that we're going as a species is the place that individuals have gone throughout history, which has resulted in great innovation, great creativity that has benefited the human race in incalculable measure. But we're going there from the perspective now of a race of individuals that are going to be participating in that creative process on an unbelievably and inconceivably exponential basis. But the initial approach to that is to begin to re-educate our perception. Because right now, our perception is standing at the gate, the locked gate, with the key in his hand, saying, you are not going any further as a species. Our perception is the limiting factor. It's not physical reality. It's not evil or good. It's not the Bilderberg Group. It's not the New World Order. It is our locked-in perception. Our perception that is limited to a process of education rather than creativity. Now, on my website at www.don'treadthisbook.net, we have some quotes that I want to relay to you. First of all, I want to remind everyone that we are on the Community Listening Network. This is your host, Keith David Henry, and this is the Progressions of Consciousness radio program. We're following up today with part 2 called The Nature of Perception. I want to cite a couple of quotes which speak directly to why perception is so important. First quote is, make the lie big. Make it simple. Keep saying it, and eventually they'll believe it. Alright, another quote. All propaganda has to be popular and has to accommodate itself to the comprehension of the least intelligent of those whom it seeks to reach. Okay? Another quote. It is always more difficult to fight against faith than against knowledge. Okay, another one. The man who has no sense of history is like a man who has no ears or eyes. There's a similar quote that says that those who forget the past are destined to repeat it. Now, those few quotes that I just spoke, some of you listening already know who made those quotes. But those quotes were coined by none other than Adolf Hitler. See, he understood the process of education and the nature of perception. And everybody's saying, you've got all of these kooky conspiracy theorists out here that are saying, this is happening and that's doing, and the government's doing this, and they've got these covert programs and all of these things going on. But what you need to understand as an individual is that it is impossible to take a human being who by nature is a spiritual, creative little god. It's impossible to control that person without educating them, without brainwashing them. If you take a person and leave them on their own with their own impulses of creativity and thought, they're going to come up with something that's going to blow you away. And if you take 1,000 people and you allow them to develop their own individuality, self-actualization, and creativity, they're going to come up with something that's so powerful that, if I can be euphemistic, it might scare God a little bit. In the Bible, there's the story of the Tower of Babel, where the people got together and they started building a tower, and they were going to go into heaven and face God face to face. And you know, the God of the Old Testament, who apparently is schizophrenic from all accounts. You know, he kills everybody one moment, and you know, he's about peace and love the next. I'm poking fun. Please forgive me. I'm poking fun at myself too, because you know, I was a preacher. But so here are these guys that are building a tower, and God says, you know, something's happening here that I have to address. These guys are all working together, and they're using their creativity, and they're using their imagination. You know, if we don't stop them now, there'll be nothing that comes into their mind that they won't be able to accomplish. Wow. I mean, wow. So the story goes that God came down and confused their language. Confused their language. They couldn't understand each other. What did that do? Well, if you can't talk, you can't collaborate. If you have creative people that can't brainstorm, they're not going to come up with any particularly valuable products. If you're thinking in terms of commerce. If you take a person and you limit them to a divisive paradigm, a paradigm of separation, then to the same degree you limit their creativity. This is what we're talking about with regard to the nature of perception. The perception is not bad. Don't misunderstand me. Subjectivity is not bad. An individual way of looking at things is not bad. The ideal that our perception is a synthesis of various other mechanisms that we use to come to a certain point of understanding, there's nothing wrong with that process. The process is perfect. The body is perfect. We as individual spiritual human beings are perfect. What's wrong? Somebody is censored blankety-blanking around with our perception. Somebody's fooling around with our perception and we don't know it. That's the whole point of the last two programs. We need to understand that our perception belongs to us. Our perception is not to be toyed with, but it has historically. This is your host, Keith David Henry. We're on the Community Listening Network. This is the end of our program. I hope you'll tune in next time, because we're going to continue with the nature of perception. I'll see you next time.